Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Patrick Spero, and I'm the librarian at the American Philosophical Society. And I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in to our final session of our symposium, Evidence, the Use and Misuse of Data. We've pulled together, I think, what is going to be a provocative and important conversation between J.R. McNeill, professor of history at Georgetown University and recent president of the American Historical Association, and Bob Hauser, the executive officer of the APS and a leading sociologist, demographer, and statistician, to talk about their perspective, not only on our past proceedings, but on the nature of evidence itself. But before we get to the session, I want to thank a number of people who made what I think has been an incredibly provocative, timely, and important symposium possible. First, I'd like to thank our Mellon postdoctoral curatorial fellows, Drs. Janine Bolt and Emily Margolis, who have curated our exhibition, Dr. Franklin, Citizen Scientist, which was the inspiration for the symposium itself. Although we couldn't open the exhibition itself this year, we will be opening it soon, and I hope everybody will be able to come in person. But in the meantime, we plan a virtual exhibition that everybody will be able to walk through online. I also want to thank Maggie Hoot and Jessica Frankenfield, who worked behind the scenes on our communications in our program. And finally, but probably most importantly, I'd like Kyle Roberts and Adriana Link to turn on their videos, because although we can't give a round of applause that they all can hear, I really want to acknowledge the incredible work that both Adriana as head of scholarly programs and Kyle as the associate director for library and museum programming put together to turn into our symposium that was scheduled for a one-day symposium in Philadelphia into a week-long virtual symposium that has gone on without a hitch. They've done a tremendous job, and I just want to thank them and have everybody else see and acknowledge them for the work that they've done throughout this conference. So thank you both. And I wish you could hear all the applause that I'm sure is happening right now at people's homes. And I want to thank the presenters who have really made this symposium so timely, important, the issues that we've confronted, the importance of facts and evidence, the ways in which evidence needs to be scrutinized and understood, the ways we can improve what we're doing are timely and important. We've also, of course, explored the inadequacies of evidences, the silences that exist in archives, and the structural reasons, the inequalities that have led to the creation of bad data and misinterpretations that continue to linger in our society. And this week has been a reminder that we can do better and we should. So with that, I'd like to turn on Dr. McNeill and Hauser to join us for this conversation. J.R. McNeill is a pioneering environmental historian who is the author of Peak Document and the Future of History, which was his presidential address at the AHA. And Bob Hauser, who is not only the executive officer of the American Philosophical Society, but spent over 40 years as one of the country's leading sociologists, demographers, and statisticians. So John, I think I will first begin with you. And I don't know if everybody's had the same pleasure I've had of reading your address, Peak Document in the Future of History. So I don't know if you could quickly summarize for us what you're proposing in it. Oh, you're muted, John.
The inevitable unmuting. So yes, I will summarize that in just a moment. But first, let me say thanks for the invitation to be part of the APS symposium. It's always important to think about how we know what we think we know and how we evaluate evidence and data. So this is an important exercise at any point in time, and certainly at this point in time. So in that paper, I reflected upon what I think might be going on in the historical profession and more broadly the study of history in general, research in history in general. And I speculated that it could be that the relative importance of documentary evidence, texts, old pieces of paper and parchment and papyrus, things that historians of my generation learned to analyze critically. The relative importance of all these may be in decline simply because there's a vast flood of other kinds of evidence being produced mainly from the natural sciences. So what I'm referring to here is things such as the ancient DNA work that geneticists are doing, which provides information about health, disease, migration in times past. I'm referring also to new technologies in archaeology, specifically LIDAR, which allows three-dimensional imaging of what lies beneath forest canopies. It's amazing what LIDAR can reveal in places like the Maya lowlands of Central America or in Cambodia. So a variety of new technologies and work coming out of the natural sciences, all focused on the past, is providing more and more information, contested, of course, information about the human past. And that seems set only to grow in quantity and significance. And if it does, then probably the relative significance of documentary sources is going to decline. That's why I use the phrase peak document. So that, in a nutshell, is what I was suggesting in that paper.
Great, thank you. And I just want to remind the audience to, at any moment, ask questions. I will be able to moderate them. We're going to have an open Q&A in a few moments. If you have a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So Bob, as a sociologist, I was wondering what your take on John's paper was. And you're muted. You're muted. Okay, good. Sorry. You're good.
Yeah, well, I thought it was tremendously stimulating when you pointed it to me, and that's why the two of us connived to ask John to join us for this session. I just think it's a marvelous paper, and you know it has gotten me to think about the ways in which the data that sociologists use has changed in recent times, in recent decades. There's always a market for sociological work that's basically ethnographic, somewhat like cultural anthropology, if you'll pardon the expression, though some of my friends would probably disagree with that, and for very small scale studies, and for studies that are based on documentary work, and for combinations of those. My two favorite sociological monographs are the first publication by the Russell Sage Foundation called Laggards in Our Schools, and W.E.B. Du Bois' magnificent treatise on the Philadelphia Negro, both of which were really kind of used multiple sources of extremely rich data. And both of which appeared more than 100 years ago. But for many decades, most of the work of sociology has been done using surveys, and in my field of demography, using censuses. But the way in which those things have been used and will be used has really evolved. Social surveys are basically dying because nobody wants to respond to them anymore. You know, I read the political polls all the time, and I wonder why I do, because a typical response rate to those is about 9%. Federal surveys now are approaching response rates of 50% from above, and they used to be above 90%. So the age of surveys is gone, and so we're basically and that's the census, especially this time, is terribly problematic. And so what's happening is that these data are being supplemented and sometimes replaced with administrative data or with earlier collections of data that can be used in novel ways. For example, my first major research effort with a collaborator, David Featherman, was to conduct a large-scale social survey of social mobility in the early 1970s. You can't do that anymore. And when I was at the National Academy of Sciences, what we tried to do was sort of resurrect the idea of doing something like that again, and it died. Nobody wanted to do it. So what are we doing instead? What we're doing instead is finding ways of linking censuses across time, linking census data across time, using it in ways that preserve privacy and confidentiality, and substituting for firsthand collection of information. So those are some of the novel things that are happening now. In economics, the primary data sources, there are a few wonderful surveys carried out by economists, but the primary data sources now for most economic work they really rely on administrative record data. So
that's great. And it makes me think about, for John, I mean, when Bob talks about how sociology and other fields are evolving as their data sources, for lack of a better word, dry up, aren't the same as they used to be. If you were to imagine a graduate student of the future fully embracing your call in this essay, do you have any ideas for some dissertations that are waiting to be written? There are probably students online now or people that have students.
Well, one of the things that's disturbing about the future that I sketch in that essay is that the degree of difficulty of cutting edge historical research might be raised. That is to say, to do the best possible historical research, researchers would need to learn how to use several different kinds of tools. And it's hard enough to become a good historian just dealing with texts. I mean, frequently, not only do you have to be able to thoughtfully analyze various kinds of texts, but you have to learn various languages in order to be up to industry standards. And the future that I'm envisioning, of course, bear in mind, I could be entirely wrong about this future. The future that I'm envisioning entails people learning how to interpret genetic data, how to interpret data from a science called proteomics, that is the study essentially of residues of proteins on various materials, and how to interpret the imagery of LIDAR. All these things require skills, and the prospect of a 20-year PhD program looms, as students might need to learn all sorts of skills that for the past 100 or 150 years, PhD students in history have not needed to learn. Now, all that said, I think instead this means that the future cutting edge research is likely more often to be conducted in teams, which is something very unfamiliar to most historians who are typically lone wolf researchers. Dissertation topics. Well, there are zillions of great dissertation topics. The most exciting ones that I can envision are ones that bring together different lines of evidence, that is, textual evidence combined with genomic evidence, combined with new types of archaeology. Whether a single individual can do this in one dissertation remains to be seen. But let me close this long-winded answer by saying the standards for a good dissertation have gotten higher and higher in my lifetime. It used to be that a student might go to one archive and write a dissertation on the basis of that. But now students go to 12, 15, 20 archives and tend to learn more languages. So the standards have been getting higher as it is. The future that I'm envisioning implies that they'll get higher still. That has good things and bad things to it.
Yeah, I can imagine that.
I would add that that what John has said about a range of different scientific skills applies to sociology as well. For example, there have been any number of studies of the life course carried out by sociologists, and they used to be just interview studies, records studies, and the like. Now, such studies carried out both by sociologists, economists, and psychologists are a mixture of survey work, documentary work, administrative record data, and genomic data. So, for example, the study that I worked on at Wisconsin for some 40 plus years really has a database of some 9,000 DNA samples that have been completely sequenced. And do I have the skills to deal with that? No, but I'm hopeful that my successors in that business are successfully bringing in people who do have the right skills.
Well, actually, Bob, your comment made me think about John again, in a sense that, as sociology too is adopting these other approaches, kind of blurring the lines between disciplines and expertise. If somebody embraces paleogenomics or geology, all these other sciences, what would distinguish a historian from a geologist? I mean, what would be distinctive of a historical subject? Define the discipline.
So as I see it, historians bring their own set of skills and sensitivities to the table, skills and sensitivities that are not cultivated in the typical formation of geologists, geneticists, or other natural scientists. And of course, the first of these is the careful analysis of texts, which the geologists and geneticists normally do not engage in. Second thing is the fullest sense of context. And this is where many people find fault in the historical work of geneticists, that there's a great deal of contextual information about the populations they study in times past that they do not enter into their assessments. And that's because in the universe in which they work, entering this contextual information, which is not genetic in its nature, into their assessments doesn't really make sense. It's not the way they operate, it's not the way they're taught to operate, and it takes a certain expansiveness of mind for them to suppose that this is actually important additional information to bring to the table. Well, historians do that. It is in our training and socialization that we try to sketch everything that we present in a set of contexts. And which context we choose, that's a judgment call. But we expect ourselves to do that, and we can offer that in collaborations with the geneticists, geologists, archaeologists. Well, archaeologists are pretty good about doing that all by themselves. I'm not sure that they can benefit as much from collaboration with historians as I think the geneticists can.
Thank you. So I now want to switch over to talk a little bit more about some of the key themes that we've talked about over the course of the week. And I want to remind everybody to keep asking their questions. They're coming in, but use the Q&A feature on the bottom of the screen, and they all will arrive here, and I'll be able to ask them in a few moments. We've been exploring evidence and data historically, but also in the present. And we've been speculating about its future uses. And if I were to summarize some of the key themes that I've seen, it's about the inadequacies of data. It's about bad data, unknowable, things that are unknowable, silences in the archives, impermanence, data cleaning, really challenging how it is we know what we think we know and how little it is that we know. So before we get to those big topics, I want to, for a moment, flip the script and ask you all to talk about good data. What makes for good data? What can we say affirmatively about evidence? And Bob, I don't know if you want to go first and turn it over to John.
Oh dear. There, in some sense, in the sciences that I deal with, there are two kinds of good data. The first really good data are those that are based on true experiments. But of course, as with physics, sociology often can rely only on observational data. So then the question really has to do with representation. That was dealt with to some degree, or at least obliquely, in Kindle's paper on data cleaning. As a demographer, the first thing that interests me is population representation. And that's really what's being challenged by a lot of the societal changes that are making it much more difficult to achieve that. So creating population representation is increasingly difficult. I'll give you an example of something that went down the tubes because of a failure to do that. And that was a few years ago, there was supposed to be a study conducted by NIH on a cohort study of births from age 0 to 21. I even had visions of preconception as the basis for that. NIH spent $1 billion on it. There was basically a running battle between demographers who said this sample must represent the population of the United States and perhaps some different population groups disproportionately to get enough statistical power, and epidemiologists who wanted to capture little pieces of territory for themselves, their own catchment areas, as they call it, within which they worked. And ultimately, NIH spent $1 billion on it, and the project was ended. It ended in total failure. So the problem there was one that's a key to the kind of work that I do is who is it? Who is being represented by this? That's an extraordinary difficult thing. The second thing is missing data in the kinds of survey or census type work that I do, and especially when people don't want to answer your questions. They'll answer some questions, but not others. And the statisticians have really provided us with a pretty good toolkit for ways of filling in such data in ways that are informative and that don't lead to a huge loss of statistical power. So that's really important. What we need to do now is to wed those new tools, I think, with the ways that we can combine data where you actually have to contact people with other sources of data, so-called big data, but they don't have to be big, they just have to be other sources of data of the sort that are routinely collected in bioelectronic means.
And I'll say two things about this, which I think may be compatible with what Bob just had to say. From my perspective, good data for historians is, in the first instance, uninterested data, by which I mean data produced by someone who has no particular stake in what that data might look like or what results it might lead to. And secondly, good data is what you might call convergent data. So when what you find in the Soviet archives matches up reasonably well with what you find in the Chinese archives and in the East German archives and in the US archives, you have convergent data. Or when you have Icelandic sagas that can be interpreted to give stories that seem to match up with the paleogenomic data from Iceland. You have convergent data. That then is good data that inspires more confidence than any single strand of data in isolation. So that's what makes us feel happy when we find convergent data and data produced or presented by people who don't have any stake in what it might mean.
Great. I have one last question, and I just want to remind everybody to ask a question in the Q&A. We have a lot of questions coming in, but please ask away. We have about 15 minutes to a half hour of further discussion. And the last is to ask you both to kind of reflect back upon your career and to talk about how your own thinking about good data and data has changed over time. One of the things, you know, that I mentioned in the introduction is this feels very timely right now. But how long has this type of critique and self-analysis been going on, and what has changed over the last, you know, 20, 30, 40 years, and even longer if you want to speculate before your own time?
Bob, you're first.
Oh dear. Afraid of that. Golly. Clearly the way in which I've been extraordinarily lucky with respect to collecting data. And that is that after that one big survey of social mobility in the mid 70s, I've done a number of different kinds of survey work, but my main preoccupation has been most fortunate in a longitudinal study of the life course of some 10,000 people now in their 80s who graduated from Wisconsin high schools in 1957. And for those of you who want to place this historically, so to speak, think about the 1970s sitcom Happy Days, which was nominally situated in the lives of the Milwaukee's high school graduating class of 1957. Those people, we were able to interest in the study throughout its duration, which is now well over 60 years. Because of their identification with their high schools, because of their identification with the state of Wisconsin and with their local communities. And so our work has not suffered the kinds of losses that are most typical in survey research nowadays. We simply conducted that at a time which was most fortunate. Since then, so I've looked around at other things that are now much less fortunate. I'm on an advisory board to the National Center for Health Statistics, which conducts two major surveys. There are others as well, but the ones of most interest to most people are the National Health Interview Survey and the National Health Examination Survey, and Haynes, and their response rates are just going steadily downward. They're constantly revising these surveys in order to try to capture the level of validity, the level of reliability that they once had, and it's a constant struggle. So I've been watching that happen for some years now.
I'd say in my professional lifetime, which stretches back to the early and mid 1980s, the most distinctive trend to the quest for evidence and data is the ongoing effort to recover what historians call the voices of people who are poorly represented, if at all represented, in the textual record. So this often means the politically powerless, the socially marginal. We sometimes call it history from below. And a good deal of ingenuity has gone into the quest to recover these voices. And one of the respects in which I think non-textual history is going to prove its worth. Because
older
genetic data, for example, can speak to the experiences of everybody in society, not just people who are literate and people who are have access to the organs of the state. But that is a long-term trend in the history business that extends back to the 1960s, but it is still ongoing. And in some respects, at least one of the most significant developments in the work of historians in my lifetime.
There's an interesting history of Philadelphia written by Gary Nash, which illustrates the problem of missingness, because he built it around the history of artifacts, and throughout the colonial period and beyond, you could find surviving artifacts from the rich. You could find actually a fair number of artifacts from the very poor, because the rich often gave various things to them, but the lives of the middle classes were basically neglected. Nothing survives in terms of artifacts that might speak to the way in which people live their lives.
Thanks. So I'm now looking at some of the questions that are coming in, and a few of them, John, deal with embracing your call, but also wondering about what it will take, which is something you've talked about. But one of the questions has to do with the relationship between, and I'll read it, it's coming from Kyle Roberts. It's been argued that because we can now do studies with big data, we should be doing studies based in big data. What is the relationship between new tools and the obligation to use them in our fields?
Well, I don't like the concept obligation much. I prefer the notion that researchers should be free to choose the tools that they regard as appropriate. But new tools are becoming available, and some of them, I would say, do open up worlds of big data, particularly in paleogenomics. But that doesn't create obligation in my mind. It creates opportunity for people who have the requisite skills themselves, or perhaps the requisite contacts to participate in collaboratives. But it doesn't, as I say it, invalidate research that ignores big data. Because every now and then you can find, whether it's in the study of colonial Philadelphia or somewhere else, insight in the microcosm that has relevance and significance well beyond the case at hand. I can remember, for example, one of the most eye-opening samples of historical work that I read in my youth. It was called the Glass Workers of Carmaux, Carmaux being a small town in southern France. It was a case study written by, I believe, Joan Scott, but I could be wrong about that. And this was anything but big data, but it demonstrated the process by which social class developed in this particular context in exquisite detail and perfect clarity. Not big data, but it was, at least to me, much more insightful and illustrative than any other study of how social class evolves, even ones based on samples 10,000 times the size of what she was working with. So I just think that big data is opportunity, but it doesn't create obligation to work with big data.
Thank you. And the next one's from Adriana Link. And it's inspired by Jacques de Swart's paper, where he talks about missing evidence. And what she asks is, I'd be curious to hear Bob and John reflect on how we might think about accidental data, evidence, and how we might go about finding missing data. If you know that there is missing data, but you might be able to discover and fill it in.
Bob, I'm looking at you again.
I don't have a good answer to that one. You know, dig deeper, go back again. One of the plagues of the survey business that I've been in for so long is people who don't want to talk to you. And sometimes they may be the most interesting, most important people. So what do? You just keep going back to them. That's what you do. One of the problems that we have is finding people. We live in a highly mobile society. So, and my staff and I developed, and my late wife developed terrific means of trying to locate people who have moved somewhere else and you don't know where. What do you do when you can't find them? You erase the search record and you start all over again, because it's a probability process, and you simply keep going at it. That's one example that's been highly salient to me. So in this longitudinal survey operation that I used to run, we always found everybody.
So from my perspective as a historian, when one is confronted with the difficulty of missing data, that means you have to look through more haystacks for the needles that you're hoping to find. And sometimes you never find them. I'll give a quick example from a research effort I undertook years ago that is reflected in a book called Mosquito Empires, published in 2010. I had convinced myself that the diseases yellow fever and malaria were extremely important to the military affairs of the Caribbean in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, and that everybody must have recognized this at the time. And I wanted to find a document in which somebody wrote, yellow fever and malaria are crucial to the outcomes of military campaigns in this region. And I couldn't find that document. Nobody seemed to write it down. Now, it could be that it was so obvious that nobody bothered to write it down. And to some extent, I think that's actually true. But there was accidental evidence that I came across from time to time that convinced me that I was, if not correct, at least plausible in making this argument. Accidental evidence such as correspondence from Toussaint Louverture, the Revolutionary War leader in Haiti in the Haitian Revolution of 1791, in which he said that, encouraging his comrades, fear not, in the rainy season, our enemies will die like flies. Well, he wasn't saying yellow fever and malaria are really important, except he was saying that in a roundabout kind of way, because the rainy season is the mosquito season, is the malaria and yellow fever season. That was an accidental find. It wasn't what I was exactly looking for, but it was a data point that I've invested with significance, and I claimed was supporting the argument that I was trying to advance. But I never did find what you could call the smoking gun document. That didn't stop me from writing the book, though.
That's great. So Bob, we have a question for you from John Peacock, and it's one that I know you've talked about to me before, but I think it'd be great for everybody else to hear. And that's, why don't people want to respond to polls and surveys now when they used to in the past? What has changed in people's willingness to respond to surveys?
It really is a puzzle in some ways, because of course we give up all sorts of information about ourselves by electronic means in the course of our daily lives now. All you have to do is try to find some product on the web, and within seconds, advertisements for that product turn up on every website you go to. And it goes on, and it's said about Facebook that you're the product. Information about you is the product, and there are all these firms out there doing that. It may be the fact that people know that, and that's somewhat of a reaction, but I think the decline in survey response actually started before that. One of the other aspects to it is that there are so many people out there conducting fake surveys, conducting commercial surveys, asking you every time you're on an airline flight. People used to travel on airlines, you may remember. And every time you're on an airline flight, you get a questionnaire from the company saying, well, how were you treated on that flight? And asking you 30 or 40 totally irrelevant questions. Every time I buy a car, I get an unbelievably lengthy questionnaire from the manufacturer or somebody representing the manufacturer. It's tiresome, it's a bother. Some of you may have heard the telephone ringing in the background before I muted myself a little while. It was a fake survey. And so I muted it until the darn ringing stopped. But that's kind of a daily annoyance, and there's no way to get around it. And so people seem to really are sort of unable to distinguish very frequently the legitimate from the useless and irrelevant contacts of that sort.
And Bob, is that part of the reason why?
Still have to protect our privacy.
Earlier you said, Bob, that the current census, the 2020 census, is I don't know exactly how you put it, but beset with difficulties. Were you referring to this issue or to the pandemic or both?
It's both. It's the fact that they cannot readily do the kind of personal follow-up. First of all, this is the first census to which people have been able to respond electronically, and that's been a wonderful thing. I don't know what the current response rate is from that mode, but whatever the modes of data collection, they're followed up personally, and people. The census workers can't do that now. So the whole thing has been sitting in abeyance. And in fact, one of the things I've heard, and I don't know whether it's come to fruition or not, is to the effect that all these thousands and thousands of census enumerators who can't do the enumeration may soon be retrained to engage in contact tracing as the pandemic proceeds. Because there are all these people out there ready to work. It's a real mess. We've never had a totally failed census, to my knowledge. One of them was lost. The census records, what was it, 1890, I think, were lost in a fire, and in that sense, the census failed. But we've never had a failed enumeration in the past, and this one is really threatened.
So I have two more questions from the audience, and then a big wrap-up one for both of you. And the next one comes from Dee Andrews, and it's aimed a little bit more at John, but Bob would love to have you speculate if you want. And she's writing as a historian, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase her question a little bit, but she's really inspired by issues surrounding vaccination and trust in science. And she notes that many of the papers that we've looked at and John's own work have looked at expanding historians' areas of expertise to other fields and disciplines. And she's wondering what the obligation, John, to use that word again, that's my word, not hers, I should note, maybe for historians to engage as they expand their expertise with the public. Specifically, she asked, how should the academic community deal with this problem? And how might expanding historians to become more embedded with scientists and scientists also change the role of historians to the public?
So once again, I'm not happy with the word obligation.
That was mine, not Dee's.
I understand. She's off the hook, but you're on the hook. I would say that historians and all scholars have the opportunity to engage with the public, and collectively have the obligation to engage with the public, but individually do not have the obligation to engage with the public. I think it's perfectly legitimate for scholars of Byzantine intellectual history to engage with one another and not with the public at large. But collectively, all the thousands and thousands of historians, whether in this country or around the world, yes, we have an obligation that some of us must meet, but not all of us. And in fact, some of us entirely lack the skills to do that. Others have those skills and should be encouraged to deploy them to engage with the public. So as you can tell, I feel a little bit animated about this particular question of how, to what extent, and who among historians ought to be engaging with the public. But can you help me a little bit, or maybe I'll open the Q&A and see exactly what issue, or areas like vaccination and other medical issues. Yeah, so somebody ought to be engaging with the public about vaccination, particularly in 2020, when we are preparing for a time, perhaps in 2021, when we have a vaccination that will be effective against COVID-19. And to judge by recent history, maybe a third of Americans will refuse to be vaccinated out of fear of unwelcome side effects of vaccination, fears that are, in any statistical sense, very remote. And trying to get that point across is an important obligation of public health officials, people in the medical profession. And it wouldn't hurt for historians to try to add their voice to that chorus, but historians have far less credibility in this particular realm than physicians and public health officials.
It strikes me that some knowledge of history could really be helpful here. You may recall that Ben Franklin, as a teenager, inveighed against smallpox inoculation when he was still in Boston and before he came to Philadelphia. And of course, he lived to regret that when his son Frankie died of smallpox many, many years later. And the historian John Barry certainly has, I think, played an important role in spreading the word about the horrors of the 1918 pandemic and what we might learn from it during this present situation.
Great, thanks.
Although it wasn't vaccination that
That wasn't vaccination, of course. That's a different story.
pandemic.
Historians.
Yeah, well, in fact, you could make a case that smallpox inoculation won the American Revolution. General Washington had the good sense to require it of every soldier in the Continental Army and avoided what was a North America-wide smallpox epidemic as a result. There's lots of good evidence that inoculation and especially vaccination is highly effective. So yeah, historians can make that point. But when it comes to convincing the general public, particularly people who are disinclined to vaccinate themselves or their children, I think it's a bit of a fond hope to think that historians will be persuasive. It's really an extremely important issue because the success of vaccination programs requires widespread subscription. So there's a lot riding on it. And it's extremely unfortunate that in the first instance, one medical researcher in Britain produced a spurious argument linking vaccination to autism, and that this has been taken up by people who have a public megaphone. Extremely important and unfortunate. So fighting back against that is an obligation.
Thank you. So the last question before the big wrap up, and there are some questions that we're not going to be able to get to, and if you still have questions, please use the Q&A. We will be able to share them with our participants, and they'll be able to respond to them later and also online. So please keep asking your questions if they come to you. So the last questions for Bob before the big wrap up one, and also I think John might be able to respond to it as well, which is, Professor Hauser, what do you think about the role and potential of ethnographic evidence in enhancing sociological research?
I love ethnography. One of my, I've got several favorite sociologists, but one of my all-time favorites is Mitchell Denier, who wrote a magnificent book about the lives of unhoused men who lived as sidewalk, who made their livings as sidewalk peddlers at 6th and Greenwich in New York City. The book is called Sidewalk. Mitch lived with these folks for 7 years on the street in order to write the book. Kathy Eden is an extraordinary ethnographer of the poor as well. And basically, at least in Mitch's case, what he did was to share the proceeds of the book with the folks who he was studying. I think that kind of work is, what should I say? It creates ideas. And folks like me like to test ideas, but we don't, at least I'm not very good at coming up with them. So I think that ethnography is just extremely important, and good ethnography is as valid as any other form of sociological research.
John, do you have anything to add?
Sounds like I have some reading ahead of me.
Yeah, great. So the last question is one for Bob and also John, but it's also one for all the participants. And again, with the ability to have interactive features in this platform, I'd love to have the participants and anybody else that's been in the audience respond to this question as well. And that is, what are some of the big themes, Bob, that you've kind of picked up over the course of this week? And what are some of the unanswered questions? And John, I know you were able to attend some of the sessions, especially I think the keynote. I would love to get your thoughts on this conversation that you've had, that conversation, any big questions that you think scholars need to address that maybe wasn't addressed in our program, things that we can think about going forward. So Bob, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think the big thing is if I had to pick one, and I've got several in mind, is the first thing on the program, and that is the role of judgment, of good judgment, expert judgment, of informed judgment in making sense of evidence. There's absolutely no substitute for that. That came through, I think, most clearly in the paper by Schiff and Stiegler and Jameson, but also in Alex Campolo's wonderful paper about John Tukey and his bad manliness. The couple of others are basically just about, all but three of the papers here were basically about analyses of texts, the old stuff, and the other three used computing data of one sort or another. But even then, one of those three was really about text, about what people read and how they communicate about what they read. But even the rest of the papers are really about an extraordinarily diverse and interesting set, different kinds of data. And I think that was really terrifically stimulating. The other thing that has to do with who rather than what they had to say, and that is the fact that the participants were on the whole so young, and they're going to take over the world. So I am really pleased that so many of the successful applications were from younger scholars. You hit the other big one here, and we've talked about it a bit before, but I just have to mention it again, and that is that missing and bad data are really, really important. So there's one piece of missing data that really irks me about this entire conference. As you recall, we had about 4 or 5 different potential themes, 5 for papers at the conference, and one of them was neglected. Nobody sought to give a paper on that, and that was the opportunities and perils presented when evidence produces unexpected results. So one of the things that I really liked about John's paper is that he gave some wonderful examples of that. And the one that really sticks in my mind has to do with the genetic ancestry of Icelanders, which, to, I think, their surprise, turns out to be through maternal mitochondrial DNA, largely from Ireland and Scotland, not from Norway, as their kind of self-professed history would have it. And I just love that finding.
Great. Thanks, Bob. John?
Part of the reason I'm interested in that particular story, Bob, is that as a McNeill, my ancestors hail from a Scottish island off the western coast called Barra, one of the so-called Outer Hebrides. And my grandfather told me when I was young that the McNeills of Barra were descended from refugees from Ireland, losers in a medieval Irish Civil War. So I thought, okay, that's fine. But I read not too terribly long ago that genetic research undertaken on the current inhabitants of the Isle of Barra, which has about 1,000 people in its population, showed nothing along those lines, and instead showed overwhelming ancestry from Scandinavia. You know, it's the kind of the reverse of the Icelandic situation.
Wow.
Apparently, my ancestors were Vikings and not losers in an Irish Civil War, as my grandfather had told me. Evidence here is not convergent. It diverges. Whom should I believe? I'm not sure if I'm being demoted or promoted, being a vicious Viking as opposed to a loser in an Irish Civil War. At any rate, that was one of the things that made the Iceland story particularly interesting to me. So getting back to Patrick's initial question, I tuned into the Schifrin, Stigler, and Jameson session about expertise and evidence and judgment. I found that very heartening. To my mind, while recognizing all the imperfections of the interpretation of evidence, it supports the notion that expert judgment is the best guide that we have, imperfect though it is, which is a position that I think I have taken already. It also harmonizes, I think, with the suggestion that I'm making about the future of evidence in historical research. Because if history research is going to get more complicated, more interdisciplinary, it means that the judgment of experts will be all the more important, because many of us are never going to be expert in all the relevant tools. We will therefore be more dependent upon the skills and judgment of experts in other fields. And I think it is appropriate that we should defer to the expertise and judgment of qualified individuals in other fields. A certain deference is owed, I think, in interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary collaborations. So I enjoyed their paper and their presentations. And I regret to say that the rest of the symposium I did not attend. I'm dealing with publisher deadlines, which I'm happy to say by midnight tonight, I will have met.
Congratulations. Well, thank you, John, for your reaction to that opening keynote. I think that's a great way for us to end. And I want to thank both of you for giving us your minds for an hour. I also want to thank all of our presenters for this week-long symposium. It really has been wonderful. The turnout has been spectacular, more than we could have ever imagined in person. And I also want to thank all the people that have tuned in over the course of this week. We thank you for all of the ways you've participated through your questions and other social media posts and everything else. And finally, I again want to thank Adriana Link and Kyle Roberts for all that they've done to put together this spectacular week. Thank you again, and goodbye. And we look forward to continuing this conversation both online. We're going to post these videos, and we also hope to publish a volume of the papers that were presented here. So the conversation, we know, will continue in other mediums and other forums. Thank you.